He laughed about her at dinner, softly enough that most of the table could pretend not to hear it. But the Duke heard, and before the final course touched the tablecloth, that same man was no longer welcome in the house. What no one understood yet was why a single remark, delivered with careless amusement, had been enough to redraw the lines of power in Ashbourne Hall, or why the one person it had been meant to wound did not react at all. Eliza Harrow had built her life on that exact skill, on the discipline of not reacting, not revealing, not allowing even the smallest crack to appear in the careful surface she presented to the world. And she had built it young, far younger than anyone in that room would have guessed, learning early that large houses carried sound in dangerous ways, that laughter could travel just as sharply as a cry, and that the difference between being tolerated and being dismissed often came down to how invisible you could make your pain. She stood now at the far edge of the dining room, one gloved hand resting lightly against the carved sideboard, her posture exact, her expression composed into the polite neutrality expected of someone who belonged to the house, but not to the table, someone useful enough to be present, but not significant enough to be noticed. And she had been very good at this for a very long time, good enough that most guests never remembered her face even after a week under the same roof, good enough that she could move through rooms filled with conversation and never once disturb its flow, good enough that when Lord Berwick leaned toward his companion with that particular tone men used when they believed themselves both clever and unobserved, and murmured something about ambition dressed as modesty, about how certain women learned to climb without ever appearing to rise, she did not move, did not shift, did not allow so much as a tightening of her jaw to betray that she had heard every word exactly as intended. It was not the insult itself that mattered. She had heard worse, had endured far worse in rooms where there had been no witnesses and no recourse. But the familiarity of it, the way it echoed something older, something she had long ago folded into silence and locked away. And so she did what she had trained herself to do. She placed the words carefully somewhere they could not touch her in that moment. She continued, overseeing the service with quiet efficiency. She inclined her head when required. She existed in the room without participating in it. And if her fingers pressed slightly harder into the fabric of her gloves, if her breath came just a fraction more controlled than before, no one at that long polished table would have noticed, no one except the man seated at its head who had, over the past year, developed an inconvenient habit of noticing things that did not belong to him. Malcolm Ashbourne, Duke of Ashbourne, had never considered himself a particularly observant man in matters that did not concern the management of his estate or the careful navigation of society's expectations, and yet he had found, without quite realizing when it began, that his attention had settled more often than not on the quiet figure who moved through his house, as though she were part of its architecture, as essential and as overlooked as the beams that held the ceilings in place, and he had told himself at first that it was simply competence he was observing, that Eliza Harrow possessed a clarity of thought and an efficiency of action that made the running of Ashbourne Hall noticeably smoother, that her presence reduced problems before they became visible, that she saw details others missed and corrected them without announcement, and this had been sufficient explanation for a time, until it was no longer sufficient, until he found himself aware not only of what she did but of how she existed, of the precise way she occupied space without claiming it, of the careful distance she maintained from every conversation, of the fact that he had never once seen her surprised, or flustered, or unguarded in any meaningful sense. And now, as Lord Berwick's words settled into the air like something fatally poisonous, Malcolm saw something else, something that had been present all along and had only now revealed itself clearly enough to be named. He saw that her composure was not ease but control, not comfort but containment, and that realization moved through him with a quiet, deliberate force that he did not immediately understand but could not ignore. He set his glass down with a soft, measured sound that nonetheless carried through the room with the weight of intention, and the conversation faltered just enough to shift attention toward him, though no one yet understood why, not even Berwick, who was still wearing the satisfied expression of a man who believed himself to have been amusing without consequence. And Malcolm spoke his name in the same tone he might have used to inquire about the weather, calm, unhurried, entirely devoid of drama, which was precisely why it drew every eye at the table. Lord Berwick, he said, and waited just long enough for the man to look up, for the small ripple of curiosity to move through the guests, for the moment to settle into something that could not be mistaken for casual conversation. "You will leave." And there was no emphasis in the words, no raised voice, no visible irritation, only certainty, which made the instruction land with a clarity that confusion could not immediately soften. Barrick blinked, then smiled in that reflexive way of men accustomed to smoothing over discomfort with charm. "I beg your pardon," he said, as though he had misheard, as though this must be a misunderstanding that could be easily corrected. But Malcolm did not offer him that correction, did not elaborate, did not provide the kind of explanation that might allow the moment to be negotiated or reframed. He simply repeated, "You will leave." And this time the room understood that something had shifted, that whatever social choreography had been expected for the evening had been quietly and completely abandoned, and the silence that followed was not polite but absolute, the kind of silence that listens, that waits to see what will happen next. Barrick's expression changed, not dramatically, not all at once, but in stages, amusement giving way to disbelief, disbelief sharpening into the first edges of offense. "Surely, Your Grace, if I have caused some misunderstanding," he began, but Malcolm interrupted him with a slight inclination of his head, not dismissive, not aggressive, simply final. "You have caused exactly what you intended," he said, "and you will not remain here to continue doing so." And that was all. No accusation spoken aloud. No need to repeat the insult that had prompted this decision, because the absence of explanation made the truth of it unmistakable to everyone who had heard enough to understand, and even to those who had not, because power, when exercised with precision, did not require detail to be effective. Barrick laughed then, too loudly, too quickly, the sound brittle at the edges. "This is absurd," he said, but the words lacked conviction, because something in Malcolm's stillness, in the complete lack of negotiation in his tone, had already made it clear that the matter was not open for discussion, and the servants, who understood the language of such moments better than any guest ever could, had already begun to move, discreetly, efficiently, the machinery of the house adjusting itself to the new reality without drawing attention to the adjustment itself. Chairs shifted, a door opened, and within minutes Lord Barrick was standing, still attempting to salvage dignity from a situation that had already stripped it from him, offering stiff farewells that no one quite met. And then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a quiet finality that echoed more loudly than any raised voice might have done. Dessert was served as though nothing had happened, as though the evening had proceeded exactly as planned, and conversation resumed in careful, measured tones. But the shape of the room had changed, the balance of it altered in a way that could not be undone, and at the head of the table Malcolm Ashbourne sat with the same composed expression he had worn all evening, as though he had done nothing more remarkable than request a change in course, and only once, briefly, did his gaze shift across the room to where Eliza Harrow stood, exactly as she had before, composed, efficient, apparently, untouched by the event that had just occurred. And yet now he knew better. Now he understood that what he had seen was not the absence of reaction, but the presence of something far more deliberate. And as their eyes met for the briefest of moments before she looked away, he found himself no longer wondering whether she had heard the insult, but how many times before this she had heard worse and been expected to endure it in silence. And that question, once formed, refused to leave him. By morning, Ashbourne Hall moved on as though nothing had happened, which was how such places survived. Not by denying events, but by smoothing them into silence. Lord Barrick's absence became an unspoken adjustment. Conversation drifted elsewhere, and the previous night dissolved into polite forgetfulness. But Eliza Harrow felt the difference in the quiet spaces between things, in the way attention shifted too carefully, in the way her own composure felt more deliberate than usual, and so she did what she always did. She retreated into her work, into the estate office where numbers behaved predictably and nothing required her to feel more than necessary, until the Duke appeared in the doorway that afternoon, an interruption she had not prepared for. He stepped inside, closed the door, and said simply, "You heard what he said." And she gave the expected answer, calm and distant. "It is not my place to concern myself with such remarks." But he did not accept it. "That is not what I asked," he replied. and after a brief pause she said, "Yes, because denial served no purpose here." He studied her quietly, then said, "You didn't react," and something in that observation unsettled her more than the insult itself. "I have learned not to," she answered, and when he asked, "Who taught you that?" she said, after the smallest hesitation, "Experience and consequence." And the weight of that answer lingered without explanation, because he did not press further, did not offer sympathy, only said, "He will not return," with a certainty that made it clear the matter was already settled. "You dismissed him," she said carefully, and he shook his head. "I removed him. There is a difference." And Eliza understood that there was, which made her ask the only question that mattered. "Why?" And his answer came without hesitation. Because he believed he could say it without consequence. And he was wrong, and there was no anger in it. Only quiet resolve, something far more difficult to dismiss. Eliza held his gaze for a moment, measuring that truth against everything she knew of the world, then said, "It won't be the last time someone thinks that way." And Malcolm inclined his head slightly. "No, but it will be the last time they say it here." And that certainty settled between them, leaving her with something unfamiliar, not relief, not trust, but the beginning of a question she had not allowed herself to ask in years: what it might mean to be seen and not punished for it. Lord Berwick did not return, and more tellingly, his absence did not go unnoticed beyond Ashbourne Hall, though no one could point to a single cause. Invitations faded, opportunities narrowed, and his influence quietly diminished in the careful, invisible way only someone like the Duke could arrange, without scandal, without accusation, only consequence. And Eliza Harrow understood enough not to ask how it had been done, only that it had been, and that it had not been done for recognition. Weeks later, she found Malcolm in the gardens and said simply, "You didn't have to do that," and he replied, "I know," which unsettled her more than any explanation would have, because it meant the choice had been entirely his. "That kind of attention creates expectation," she said carefully, and he looked at her then and asked, "And what do you expect?" And after a pause she answered, "Nothing," because that had always been safest. But he shook his head slightly. "That may be how it has been, not how it must remain." And there was no pressure in it, no demand, only the quiet offering of something different. Eliza held his gaze a moment longer than she normally would, and for the first time she did not feel the need to look away, because this was not pity, not protection that required repayment, but something steadier, respect, given without condition. And as she turned to leave, she realized the most important change had not been Berwick's removal, but the simple, unfamiliar fact that she had been seen, had not been silenced, and nothing had been taken from her because of it. And that, more than anything, was what stayed with her.